Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative.
Awaiting order. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
New construction options.
Yes,
Building.
acknowledged. Affirmative.
Waiting
Got
order.
it. Right away, sir.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building. On hold. Cancel.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Knowledge. Affirmative. Knowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Building.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Construction complete. Unit ready.
Yes, acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Vehicle. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Awaiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Report. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Vehicle acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting.
Affirmative. Awaiting order. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes,
Acknowledged.
sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Incoming funds.
Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building.
Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Waiting. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Report. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Waiting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Acknowledge. Waiting knowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Vehicle report. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Reporting. Knowledge. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Reporting.
Base under attack. On hold.
Report. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Reporting. Not a problem. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting. Reporting. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Roger. Yes, you got it. You got it.
Building.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Insufficient funds.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Waiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Structure sold. Construction complete. Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Vehicle reported. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Construction complete.
Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Insufficient
Acknowledge.
funds.
Acknowledge.
Vehicle reporting.
Building. On hold. Cancelled. Construction complete. Building.
Yes. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Construction complete. New construction options.
Reporting. Acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Awaiting affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Awaiting order. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Awaiting orders.
Vehicle reporting. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Awaiting. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Construction complete. Building.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Wait. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Report. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Insufficient funds.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Awaiting order. Affirmative. Affirmative. Vehicle report. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Waiting. Affirmative. Knowledge. Waiting. Knowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Knowledge.
ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Vehicle reported.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Reporting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Construction complete.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building. Building.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Reporting.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Awaiting order.
Structure sold.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
On hold. Cancel.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Awaiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Vehicle reporting. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Vehicle reporting. Vehicle report. Acknowledge. Awaiting order. Acknowledge. Reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Building.
Acknowledged.
Ready and
Structure
waiting.
Roger.
sold.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting.
Yes, sir. Roger. Right away, sir. Waiting order. Affirmative. Ready and waiting. Roger.
Reporting. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. You've got it.
Insufficient
Roger.
funds.
You've got it. Affirmative. Affirmative. Roger. Right away, sir. Reporting. You've got affirmative. Roger. Not a problem.
Acknowledge.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Reporting. Yes, right away, sir.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative.
Construction complete.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Awaiting order. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Right away, sir. Affirmative.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete. New construction options.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Yes, sir.
Vehicle report. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Building.
Yes, you've got it.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Got it. Affirmative.
Report knowledge.
Yes, sir.
Awaiting order.
Affirmative.
Awaiting order. Acknowledge. Vehicle reported.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Vehicle reporting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Insufficient funds.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Structure sold.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Reporting. Vehicle report. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Construction complete.
Awaiting order. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. 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 Acknowledge.
Unit
Acknowledge.
ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Vehicle reporting.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledge.
Construction complete. Structure sold. On hold. Building. Structure sold. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Yes,
Primary
sir.
building
Yes,
set.
sir.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Right away, sir.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Awaiting orders.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Awaiting orders.
Acknowledge.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Yes, acknowledge.
Vehicle reporting.
Building. On hold.